Imagine for just a second the concept of freedom.
Okay.
When we say that word, especially here in the West, we usually picture it as this universal good.
Liberty, justice, all of that.
All of that, the American dream. It's the idea that you can do what you want, live how you want, don't tread on me. It's foundational.
It is. It's the word that ends every political speech.
Yeah.
The thing we're all supposed to want more of.
Exactly. But I want to start today with a really jarring contradiction, a very uncomfortable question.
Go on.
What if freedom was actually used as a weapon? What if the freedom to do whatever you want actually meant the freedom to oppress someone else?
What if my liberty depends entirely on your subjugation?
Yes.
That's a disturbing thought. And it's precisely the central tension we're grappling with today. We're looking at the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Freedom's Dominion, a saga of white resistance to federal power by the historian Jefferson Cowie.
And this book is heavy. It's a deep historical look at how the rhetoric of liberty has been used in ways that might, well, frankly, shock you.
It's powerful stuff.
But, and here's the twist for our conversation, we aren't just summarizing the history. We're looking at Cowie's work through a specific critical framework. We're going to challenge how we define freedom versus domination.
Exactly. And we need to be clear from the outset, we're impartial observers here.
Absolutely.
We're unpacking the author's thesis and the counter-arguments. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the historical figures discussed.
Not at all. As Cowie documents, some of their actions are just horrific. Our goal is to understand the mechanics of their arguments.
Right. And to do that, Cowie takes us to one very specific place on the map.
Barber County, Alabama.
A small place, deeply rural. But in this book, it serves as a microcosm for a much larger, darker American story.
It's actually the birthplace of the segregationist George Wallace, which that gives you a hint of where this is all going.
It really sets the stage. So the plan is to move through 4 distinct eras. We'll start with Indian removal in the 1830s and go all the way to the civil rights movement.
And through it all, we'll see how this rhetoric of liberty was used to justify land theft and slavery. And then we'll apply this reciprocity test to see if those arguments even hold water.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we have to start with the big idea. Cowie's core argument is, well, it's pretty provocative.
It is. He claims that throughout American history, the white citizens of Barber County basically weaponized the language of individual liberty to fight the federal government.
So as Cowie argues, the resistance wasn't just about hating the government for no reason.
No, it was a very specific type of resistance. He calls it racialized anti-statism.
Racialized anti-statism. That's a mouthful. Let's break that down.
Sure. So anti-statism is just the belief that the federal government, is the enemy of freedom.
Right. Washington, D.C. is a tyranny trying to crush local control.
Exactly. But Cowie adds the word racialized because, as the book details, this hatred of the government almost always flared up, specifically when the government tried to protect the rights of non-white people.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me. I mean, usually we look back at things like slavery and think, well, that's a contradiction of American freedom.
Of course.
How can you be free if you own slaves? But Cowie argues that for these people, it wasn't a contradiction.
No. For them, it was an expression of their freedom. It was the freedom to dominate.
That is the aha moment in the book. They saw the capacity to control others, to seize land, to enslave, to segregate as a fundamental right.
And if the federal government stepped in to stop them?
The government was the oppressor.
Precisely. However, the critique we're using today really throws a wrench in that.
Yeah.
It suggests Cowie might be conflating 2 very different things.
Okay.
The critique argues that what Cowie is describing isn't freedom at all. It's a perversion of freedom.
A perversion.
Yes. It introduces this fundamental philosophical distinction between freedom and license.
License. You don't mean like a driver's license.
No. License in the philosophical sense. Think of it more like licentiousness.
Right.
License is the ability to do whatever you want, to act on your impulses, even if it harms someone else. It's unchecked will.
Whereas freedom requires boundaries. It requires recognizing that other people have rights too.
Exactly. So the critique suggests Cowie is describing license, the license to oppress, but he's letting the historical figures call it freedom without pushing back enough on the definition itself.
So by calling it freedom to dominate, we might be dignifying it. We're letting them win the propaganda war.
That's the argument. That true freedom requires reciprocity.
That is a really helpful framework. The book says this was their version of freedom, and the critique says, no, that's just tyranny dressed up as freedom.
A perfect summary.
Let's test this out. Let's go to the first era Cowie covers, the frontier and Indian dispossession in the 1830s.
Right, this is a brutal chapter. Cowie documents how white settlers just moved onto land that was explicitly guaranteed to the Creek people by federal treaties.
So this wasn't unclaimed land. It was legally protected territory.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the rhetoric these settlers used is fascinating. They claimed local control. They talked about freedom from the federal government.
And there's this one figure Cowie focuses on, Hardeman Owens. He basically became a folk hero for this.
Owens is a perfect example of this whole dynamic. As Cowie details, Owens was essentially a squatter on Creek land.
Right.
And when federal marshals came to enforce the treaty, to tell him he couldn't steal this land, he didn't just refuse to leave. He actually planted an explosive mine in his house.
You're kidding.
He threatened to blow up the federal officers.
That is intense. He was literally ready to kill federal agents to keep stolen property.
And when he was eventually killed during a standoff, the locals didn't see a criminal, they saw a martyr.
Of course they did.
Cowie notes the local press spun this whole narrative that big bad federal government had murdered a free man just trying to make a living.
Completely ignoring the fact that his living was based on theft.
Completely. But if we apply the critiques lens, this inconsistency test, the whole narrative just cracks.
How so?
The critique notes this massive hypocrisy. These settlers claim to hate the federal government. But when the Creek Nation finally resisted and threatened the settlers' survival, what did those so-called freedom-loving intruders do?
I'm guessing they didn't handle it on their own.
Not a chance. They immediately turned to the federal government. They begged for federal troops to come and protect them.
Wow.
As the critique notes, this proves their anti-statism was fake. It was opportunistic.
It wasn't a principled stand for small government?
Not at all. It was a strategy to secure domination.
Yeah.
They hated the government when it acted as a referee enforcing the law.
But they loved the government when it acted as a bouncer to kick out the people they were robbing. That distinction, that is crystal clear.
It is.
And that pattern just seems to repeat itself. Let's fast forward to the second era, Reconstruction. We're talking 1860s, 1870s.
This is maybe the most violent era in the entire book. We have to talk about the Eufaula election massacre of 1874. Cowie documents this event in just horrific detail. Yet a paramilitary group called the White League that essentially declared war on black voters.
And we should be clear, at this point, black men had the right to vote. They actually held political power in Barber County.
They did.
Yeah.
And the White League found that completely intolerable. Cowie documents that on Election Day, they opened fire on unarmed black voters.
Just open fire.
Murdered several people, injured nearly 100 more. They physically drove over 1,000 people away from the polls.
And it worked. They retook control of the county through pure violence.
And once they did, the legal system became a weapon. Cowie explains how they used these things called vagrancy laws.
Which meant what exactly?
Essentially, if a black man couldn't prove he was employed, if he didn't have a labor contract with a white landowner, he could be arrested.
Which led to convict leasing. They'd arrest you, fine you, and then lease you out to a mine or plantation to work off the debt.
It was slavery by another name. The statistics Cowie provides are just staggering.
I remember this part.
He notes that in Alabama, the black imprisonment rate went from about number 8% in 1871 when they had voting rights to number 91% by 1877.
Let that sink in. From number 8 to number 91% in 6 years. That's efficient tyranny. And yet, they defended this system using the language of freedom.
They did.
How could they possibly call mass incarceration and massacre freedom?
Well, Cowie explains that from their perspective, any federal attempt to protect black voters was tyranny against white local rule.
To them, freedom meant the right of the local white community to arrange society exactly as they saw fit.
Anything that challenged that hierarchy was an infringement on their liberty.
This is where the critique brings in the golden rule, isn't it?
It is. The critique argues this can't be freedom because there's no reciprocity. It highlights what's called the equivocation fallacy, using one word to mean two different things.
Right. The White League members would never accept being massacred at a polling place.
Of course not.
They wouldn't accept being arrested for walking down the street without a contract.
Never. So the critique argues their claim to freedom was logically bankrupt. It was a mask for terror. If your definition of freedom only works when you're the one holding the gun, it isn't freedom. It's just power.
It's freedom for me, but not for thee, taken to the absolute extreme. So, moving into the 20th century, we get to the third era, the New Deal. This one's tricky
Yes.
because usually we think of the 1930s and FDR as this time of progress, of government helping the little guy.
And it was, but it's nuanced. Cowie argues that Franklin D. Roosevelt had to make a metaphorical deal with the devil.
He needed Southern votes.
Desperately. To pass the New Deal economic programs, he needed that massive Southern voting bloc, which was a one-party state controlled by these same forces we've been talking about.
And the cost of those votes was ignoring racial terror.
Yes. Cowie points out that FDR refused to publicly endorse anti-lynching bills, even when he had a supermajority in Congress between 1937 and 1939.
He had the power to make lynching a federal crime, but he just didn't use it.
Didn't use it. Didn't want to upset the Southern Democrats.
So in this case, it wasn't locals fighting the feds. It was the feds looking the other way.
Exactly. And the critique notes that this era demonstrates federal complicity. It sort of undermines the idea that this was always a story of resistance to government.
Sometimes the government was a willing partner.
A willing partner. The critique argues the problem here wasn't federal overreach causing resistance, it was federal inaction allowing domination to continue.
That brings us to the fourth era, and probably the most famous face in this whole story, George Wallace, the 1950s and 60s, and he came right out of Barber County.
He is the absolute figurehead of this entire philosophy. Wallace used the rhetoric of states' rights to frame segregation as a noble battle for liberty against a tyrannical federal government.
The famous image of him standing in this schoolhouse door.
Exactly. To stop integration at the University of Alabama, he claimed he was fighting for the Constitution. I'm not a racist. I'm a defender of local sovereignty.
Right. But this is where it gets really, really interesting again. The critique points out this massive, glaring contradiction from Wallace's era.
The money.
The money. While he was screaming about keeping the feds out of Alabama, Eufaula officials, his own neighbors, were happily applying for and accepting Federal Housing Act funds.
Millions of dollars of it.
So keep your laws off our schools, but please send us the checks.
It's even worse than that. As Cowie documents, they used that federal money and the federal power of eminent domain to seize land and destroy black neighborhoods.
So they were using federal funds to build segregated infrastructure.
Exactly. So they didn't hate the federal government. They just wanted to use it as a tool for their own goals.
The critique calls this selective anti-statism.
That's the term. They didn't hate the government. They hated equality. They used federal money to build segregation while claiming the federal government was the enemy.
It just destroys the idea that they had some principled stance against government intervention.
It was hollow. They loved intervention when it served their specific social hierarchy.
It's just gaslighting on a historical scale. So now that we've walked through the history, from the frontier to George Wallace, we need to step back. The critique proposes a constitutional and moral test.
Right. We've established the history. Now we apply the framework. The critique uses the preamble to the U.S. Constitution as a kind of scorecard.
The goals of the nation: establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote general welfare.
Let's run the scorecard.
Okay. Did Barber County's version of freedom establish justice?
The critique says absolutely not. Massacres, lynching, disenfranchisement. These are the antithesis of justice. A legal system designed to entrap people is not justice.
Did it ensure domestic tranquility?
No. It relied on constant racial terrorism. You can't have tranquility in a state of oppression. You can't have peace when one part of the population lives in constant fear.
And did it promote the general welfare?
Also no.
Yeah.
The economy was based on coerced labor slavery, then convict leasing. That's the welfare of a few at the expense of the many. It impoverished the whole region in the long run.
So this brings us back to the big question. Was Cowie right? Is the freedom to dominate a legitimate type of freedom?
This is the final verdict, according to the critique. Cowie is absolutely right about the history. The facts are undeniable. The research is meticulous. These things happened, and they happened under the banner of freedom.
But
the critique argues he might be wrong about the philosophy. By accepting their definition, by agreeing that this was a type of freedom, we risk validating it.
so we shouldn't accept the racists' definition of freedom.
I should call it what it was, domination.
Because if we accept that freedom can mean oppressing others, we are on very dangerous ground.
Exactly. The critique suggests that if we accept their definition, we risk normalizing the idea that oppression is just a difference of opinion on what freedom means. It argues that true freedom must be tied to human dignity and reciprocity.
If your freedom relies on taking away someone else's,
It's not freedom, it's license, it's power, but it's not liberty.
that is such a crucial distinction. It stops us from just nodding along when someone uses a buzzword like liberty. It forces us to ask, freedom for whom and at whose expense?
And that's why this book and this analysis are so important. We saw how the word freedom was twisted for over a century to justify the exact opposite of liberty.
The pattern was consistent: claim victimhood, shout about tyranny, and then use power to crush anyone below you.
The takeaway here is really about being a critical consumer of political language.
Yeah.
Just because someone shouts liberty doesn't mean they support freedom for everyone. You have to look at what they're actually doing.
It connects right back to that reciprocity test. The golden rule isn't just a moral nicety, it's a political stress test.
Right. Ask yourself, would the people in power accept being treated the way they're treating others? In Barber County, the answer was always, unequivocally, no.
That is a powerful place to land. It makes you look at the news a little differently, doesn't it? It makes you realize that history is a constant battle over the definition of words.
It certainly is. And that battle is still happening today.
So, here's a provocative thought to leave you with, something to mull over. If true freedom requires reciprocity, the willingness to grant the same rights to others that you claim for yourself, how much of today's political rhetoric would actually pass that test?
How many movements today are fighting for freedom, and how many are really fighting for license?
That's the question.
And the answer might be uncomfortable.
Thanks for joining us on this discussion of freedom's dominion and the critique. It's heavy stuff, but understanding it is the only way to see through the noise.
Absolutely. Always look deeper.
Check out the book and the critique if you want to get into the weeds. Until next time, stay curious.